So today we're going to be talking about, what superstitions exist, what are they, why do we believe in them, and how do they kind of drive our decision making from two different perspectives within psychology and philosophy. So just a reminder, so we have a Q&A section of the Zoom on the lower panel. So when you click on the Q&A, you can ask your questions in there, and we'll get to that towards the end of the event for the Q&A portion. So if you have any questions, make sure to use the Q&A portion, not the traditional chat feature in Zoom, because then we can address questions as they come in towards the end of the event. So like I said, welcome everyone. So today we have two amazing professors with us to talk about, looking at superstitions and driving choice. And tonight we have Professor Katherine Fox-Glassman. Professor Fox-Glassman is a psychology professor at Columbia currently, and started out studying seismology and volcanology before turning to cognitive science to better understand how humans think about and make decisions about earthquakes, volcanic eruptions, and other rare, potentially high impact events. She joined the Columbia Psychology Department in 2015 as a lecturer and director of undergraduate studies, where she teaches courses on statistics, research methods, and judgment and decision-making. Her research focuses on risk perception and decision-making under uncertainty. And I was lucky enough to take her class a year ago called Thinking and Decision Making. So we're very excited to have Professor Fox-Glassman with us tonight. And then our other speaker is Professor Melissa Fusco. So Professor Fusco joined the Columbia University Department of Philosophy in 2016, and she works in philosophy of language, especially formal semantics, decision theory, and philosophical logic. She also has interests in metaethics and metaphysics, and her current projects include natural language theories of modality and the semantics of disjunctive questions. So, like I said, we have two amazing professors with us to speak about these questions that we have about superstitions and driving choices that we make as human beings, because this year has been wild in trying to make decisions about how to navigate the current pandemic, how to navigate online school, online work from home. So this has been a really interesting time to kind of look at superstitions and how they drive human choice. So our first question for both of you is if you could tell us a little bit more about yourself besides what I just read off from your bios and the work that you do currently.
Sure, who should start?
Either one of you, totally fine.
All right, sure. Hello. Let's see, a little bit more about myself. In the kind of philosophy that I study, it's common to have philosophy be sort of allied, the kind of philosophy that you do to be allied with an empirical science. So for example, in our department, we have philosophers of physics who study physics as well as the philosophy of physics and the history of science, which involves, the history of development of physics and so on. So I'm a philosopher of language, and I've worked with linguists because that's kind of the natural cognate empirical science for me. I've done a little bit of field work in Romance languages and such, and some of my work sort of straddles the gap between linguistics and philosophy, which is kind of a fun area to be working in because the line dividing the two is pretty thin. So there are, for example, sort of joint research journals like Linguistics and Philosophy or Semantics and Pragmatics. Linguistics, on one way of putting the history of science, is kind of a young science. The way that it's studied now sort of began in, the lifetime of Noam Chomsky, who's still alive. So it's much younger as a science than physics or chemistry or astronomy. The study of it is well placed, I think, in philosophy as being sort of at the edge of the humanities and the sciences.
And then Professor Fox-Glassman.
Hey, yes, hey everybody. Yeah, so I took a really circuitous route to the thing that I study, and I still am sort of in a different way than Professor Fusco. I'm kind of in an interdisciplinary niche because I grew up in Southern California, and when I was 10, my family moved to Germany, and when I got to know the other kids, there were two or three different really common questions they would ask me. They would ask me. If how often I met movie stars, right? Which was at that point not very often because I couldn't drive and lived in the suburbs. They asked me how many cacti there were in where I lived. Also, not a ton of those. That was disappointing to them. And they also asked me, how scary is it to live in a place where there's so many earthquakes? And that question I could actually talk about because I'd experienced a bunch of earthquakes as a kid, but it was strange to me that they were all asking about it from this position of like, this seems very scary. Because to me, I grew up with it. I had all this experience with earthquakes, and it just felt like this is part of where I live. It's just a thing, right? Earthquakes were actually kind of exciting, right, for me as a kid. Cut to 8 years later, and I started college, and I thought, actually, I want to study earthquakes. And so I did, and I studied the geophysics and the seismology kind of sides, and I got into volcanoes and went and did field study on Mount Kilauea, and scooped lava out of the active lava flows, and that was really cool. But the whole time, every time I was reading these like case studies of this eruption came down, or this lahar, this volcanic mud flow came down and destroyed this town, the town that was built on top of the previous town that had been destroyed by the previous eruption. And I kept seeing that kind of pattern over and over, and kept thinking, like, how are these people, why are these people building in these places that demonstrably are dangerous? And how does this, like, living in literally like the shadow of this danger in the case of volcanoes, or living on unstable ground in the case of earthquakes, how does that affect just people's everyday decisions? How does it affect the way they think about risk? And so I eventually kind of took a turn towards the study of people. So now I'm in psychology, and most of my time now is focused on teaching and on kind of thinking about the psych major and advising undergrads and all that. But the research that I do is focused on kind of thinking about different risks, different hazards in our environment, and how we think differently about them, right? Like, what is different about earthquakes versus hurricanes versus dust storms versus different kinds of like toxins in the environment, or climate change, or sea level rise. They all have these, they hit us in different ways, and all of the kind of cognitive biases and kind of ways that we think about stuff interacts differently with all these different particular hazards. So I'm really interested in risk perception and decision making in that kind of particular sense, and then I teach about it more generally. And so yeah, I think it is always a relevant topic. I have felt in the last couple of semesters that it's especially relevant, and my students have brought me lots of examples of everyday occurrences and news stories and things that they feel like are relevant to course topics. So yeah, so I'm excited to see what kind of questions about that kind of stuff you guys have here.
Thank you both for elaborating further off of the bios that I read. I really appreciate it. And I'm sure our attendees appreciate learning more about you before we kind of get into the meat of what the event is. So for both of you, what comes to mind when you hear the word superstition? Like, it can be kind of a personal, like what comes onto your mind, or like how the field you work in kind of influences maybe what you see as superstitious thinking, or what a superstition is.
Should I start again?
Yeah.
Okay. Well, I'll answer just the way I answered when you guys asked me first about this event. So right now I'm reading this book called Evidence, Decision, and Causality for some research that I'm doing. And the book is very bold. The introduction begins with the sentence, "Causality is a pointless superstition." And so the idea is, if you do almost anything, right? If you get educated, people tell you to distinguish correlation from causation, right? Don't confuse one for the other. But it looks like data gives us correlations, and data doesn't directly tell us when there's causation. Usually when we're being told don't conflate causation and correlation, we're saying don't jump to the conclusion that there's causation where there could be mere correlation. But that raises the question, sort of again in the philosophy of science, skepticism about causation goes back at least to David Hume, where the question is, well, how do you establish causation if you can't get it from correlation? If it doesn't come from the numbers, if the numbers only ever establish correlation, why think that causation even exists, or when methodologically is it worth postulating? And there are some extreme skeptics who believe that the answer is never, right? It's sort of like correlations allow you to look at the world as if through a black and white TV, and you're trying to infer color from the black and white. When do you have enough evidence to infer that there's color or what color things are? Maybe you never do. Maybe that's just a pointless, it's my dog, a pointless superstition. Whether you believe that or not, of course, has really important consequences for how you're going to make decisions. That is at the level of policy and government. I know less about that. What I tend to study more is, one person, perfect information, rational decision making, what's known as that's normative decision theory. So more generally, maybe just to describe the way that philosophy is situated with regard to some of the stuff I was saying earlier, some of the things that we investigate are things that certain people have said are superstitions, but they're things that we're not sure how we could live without. Causation is one of them. Free will is presumably another. Maybe causation is all an illusion. We never have reason to postulate causal relations. Maybe we never have reason to postulate free will, but if we really tried to live without those notions, it seems like it would be difficult to understand ourselves. Maybe we should learn to live with it. I mean, some superstitions are worth giving up and some aren't. But to call something a superstition to me is just to invoke skepticism about something that we feel like we can't do without. And that dialectic in philosophy of science and for causation, for example, it has like a very long pedigree in the history of philosophy.
So yeah, so my answer, I kind of wish I went first because my answer is much less like philosophical and lyrical than that. Like it's more in the pragmatic sense. But I think the way a lot of people use superstition is like kind of in the specific sense, like when people say like, oh, this is a superstition, they mean something in the range of, belief in some sort of supernatural or not understood or kind of external power affecting something, right? Or, having to do with like luckiness, right? Not just random chance, but random chance that's sort of pushed in one direction or another by something, right? In psychology, or at least from my background, I would sort of generalize that more to superstition as being sort of any like belief in some cause and effect structure that doesn't exist in reality, right? And as Professor Fusco said, like determining what reality is a whole nother problem. But when people are essentially attributing outcomes to like non-natural or non-random chance kind of causes in a world that is, at least for many scientists, governed by natural causes and random chance, that's what I tend to call superstition. I think that probably in this room, there's lots more definitions. There's a different one for each of us slightly, but.
Thank you so much, because having taken philosophy and majoring in psychology, there's definitely been an overlap between the two and like kind of addressing how to postulate and trying to see correlations and not imply causation immediately and jump to conclusions. So I really appreciate both of you kind of defining how you see it within your fields as well. So our next question is for Professor Fox-Glassman. And within the field of psychology, looking at past research, how and why do people form superstitious beliefs? Like, is there any kind of leading research as to like a single explanation, multiple. I know a single explanation is probably way too difficult to find.
That would be so nice, right? If it was all like just one kind of top down. Yeah, I think there are a lot of different contributors to it and components. And I would say actually that I know we're probably most focused on people, but there's plenty of psych research, especially from kind of earlier days of like the behaviorists, that shows superstition in animals as well, right? Like the classic cats in Skinner boxes, right? Where if you have Skinner would put a cat in a box, and cats don't like to be trapped, you know, so they're like, I want to get out. And the box is set up so that there's something that the cat can do to get out, to open the door, right? It's like a lever or a button or a thing to pull or something to push, or, you know, there's some way for the cat to get itself out. It doesn't know, right? It's a cat, it's motivated, but you know, it's not an engineer. So it's in there and it's just trying stuff, right? It's like pushing this and nudging that and turning around and being generally very, you know, angry, probably. And eventually if it hits, like, let's say it's a lever, it hits the lever. The next time you put the cat back in that box, it is most of the time going to reproduce like the whole sequence or a lot of the sequence of actions that it took before. It's not just going to try like, it was the last thing I did, right? It's like, okay, I have to turn around and then I have to nudge this and then I have to arch my back and then I have to hit the lever, right? So, and you can think of that as sort of superstitious behavior, right? It's like, that's not the cause, but it's the cat's understanding of the cause, right? And so in that case, it's kind of a nice one because we can say, no, I built the box, right? It's just the lever. I know this, like the cat doesn't, I do. In the real world, we didn't build the box. So it's trickier, but so to your question of why, I think there are a lot of motivational reasons why we tend to believe superstitious thing. There are also just sort of some like kind of practical, and you can think of them as maybe even evolutionary reasons, right? To kind of round up to, I think this is causal, or to kind of tend to see patterns where there may just be noise, that it's just maybe random chance, but I'm going to say like, that looks maybe like a pattern that I should pay attention to, right? You get the classic example of, you know, early human out on the plain sees kind of movement out of the corner of their eye. And there's two ways you can be mistaken about that, right? You can say like, all right, you know, that's, it might be a lion, right, in the grass. Maybe I should jump up and like get ready to run away. And you could be wrong. It could be just the wind waving the grass, and then you're kind of embarrassed, or you've, you know, wasted some adrenaline or whatever. So that's an error. It's maybe not though as bad as the error of, yeah, it's probably just wind in the grass and then the lion eats you, right? So assuming a pattern is there can be just sort of protective in some ways. But there's also those motivational reasons, like believing in patterns, believing in a structure, even if it's not there, can give us more confidence, right? Because you think about like the athlete who's wearing their lucky socks, right? And you could, you know, most of us probably don't believe that socks can make you better at baseball or soccer or something. You know, maybe some of us believe that they can. But when you ask athletes about this, mostly they say like, no, I know the socks don't actually help me, but I feel better wearing them, right? I have more confidence. And so I just feel more competent, and having confidence, a lot of times, you know, humans don't need help being overconfident. We tend towards overconfidence, but that's often for good motivational reasons, because it causes us to try things. And often we succeed, right? Even if we thought there was a 90% chance, there was really an 80% chance, we're still going to do well then 80% of the time, right? There are a bunch of studies actually that encouraging superstitious beliefs in people, like telling them like, okay, this is a lucky golf ball, like this green ball, luckier, you'll do better with this one than the others, actually translates to better outcomes in sort of like motor and even some cognitive tasks, right? But it's super variable how it affects people. It doesn't help some people at all. It helps some people a ton. And weirdly enough, it's hard to figure out what the modulator of that is, right? It's not just like belief in superstition. There's something more going on, and it's still sort of a mystery. And then I would say just the last kind of reason from the psych side that I think superstitions are so common, or that we tend toward them so much, is that a lot of times the superstitious belief is sort of simpler than the real story, right? So you get things like the post hoc fallacy, which comes from the Latin post hoc ergo propter hoc, which means after this, therefore because of this, So we think that an event that followed another event was caused by the first one, right? So there, the kind of classic example is, person gets their flu shot on Monday, on Tuesday they start feeling a little bad, and they get the flu and they're sick for a week, right? So it's not just like the side effects of the shot, they're like, they really got the flu, right? And they say like, man, I didn't think that, people told me that the flu shot can't give you the flu, but I mean, like, look at the evidence, right? Monday, got the shot, Tuesday, got the flu. Can't really argue against that. And, you can argue against that. The flu shot actually can't give you the flu. The way it's made makes that impossible. But, whatever you did over the weekend, being exposed to a bunch of people, you took a train to Boston or something, that's probably what gave you the flu. But that's not as sort of in the center of your mind. It's not in your mind connected with the flu, right? So this, just like event A precedes event B, and this post hoc fallacy makes us kind of think A must have caused B. Right? So that's also a superstition in a way. And it's easier to just say like, it was the flu shot that gave me the flu, rather than like, what are all of the other things it could have possibly been? So our brains find a lot of ways to make things easier for us. And I think this is one of them.
Yeah, I was definitely that athlete when I was younger who put one sock on before the second one to make sure that I won or scored a goal or anything like that. So I think I've been susceptible to so many, superstitions, and mostly I like you spoke about with other athletes, I did it because it made me feel better, like and more calm going into a game. So I really appreciated that example as well.
Yeah, and we do a lot of things that we don't actually believe have causal structure, right? Like, and especially as kids, right? Because like kids are like figuring that their whole job is to go around the world figuring out cause and effect, right? So they are going out and saying like, okay, could this have caused this? Could this have caused this? Let me like try out all these things, right? So when someone tells them, the rhyme about stepping on a crack, they're like, I can't step on a crack, right? This is going to be terrible. But even when you're an adult, often that kind of thing kind of lingers, right? Like if I'm walking on the sidewalk and if it's all kind of not more difficult to step over the crack than on it, I will probably still do that, right? And I'm, you can ask my students, I'm probably way far on the edge of like thinking rationally about most things. And yet, if I have the chance, I'm probably going to step over the crack, right? I don't think it's going to do anything, but like I still step over it, right?
So thank you. I really appreciated that. And then for Professor Fusco, so I know you spoke about how, philosophy and looking at decision making is similar to other fields within like philosophy of science and psychology, but how does the study of decision making in philosophy differ from other fields like psychology? Like what kind of, are there different methods? Are there different research tactics? And if there's anything you can speak to on that as well.
Yeah, I mean, that's interesting. And, Professor Fox-Glassman should help me here because, it's sort of like asking somebody who speaks English how English is different from Chinese, and I'm sort of like, well, I could tell you a lot about English, but, the rest will have to be implicit by contrast. So, one thing that is true about normative decision theory in philosophy is that it's kind of based, and this is not particular to decision theory, but it's based around puzzle cases that kind of drive things. And so, if you took an ethics class or something, you'll be familiar with this kind of methodology. Here's a puzzle case, there's a trolley problem or something like that. What do we say? Let's divide people up by how they answer and why. So, there are classic results that I think for most educated people in the sciences included, are things like the platitude that correlation isn't causation. And that's great, it isn't. But if you scratch the surface, there's a lot of, monsters underneath that really don't have firm answers. And so that's where, we go and we try and find questions that reasonable people disagree about to see, whether there's some way of adjudicating those questions, sort of at the edge of things that are taken for granted methodologically, let's say, in the sciences. So, just to give you an example that doesn't have to do with correlation and causation, that is in decision theory, there are sort of classic results in decision theory that are known as paradoxes about risk aversion, right? So one is called the Alli paradox, for example. Some of you might have heard of that. So this is about how people tend to be risk averse, right? So if I say you can either have 50 cents or you can flip a fair coin, and if it lands heads, you get $1, and if it lands tails, you get nothing, right? Generally, people will tend to prefer the sure thing, 50 cents. And if you make the numbers bigger, then sometimes the effect is magnified. Now, usually that's explained, the foundations of economics by expected utility theory. So there's an obvious sense in which the expected utility of a 50% chance of $1 and a 50% chance of nothing is just 50 cents, which is exactly the same as the sure thing that you get, right? But as people will know, the way that you try and account for risk aversion in those cases, or in generalizations of those cases, are by assuming that utility isn't linear with money, right? That the utility curve for money kind of flattens after a while. So the difference, in happiness that an additional $10 gives you if you're already a millionaire is less than the difference that it would make if you're super poor, right? However, if you really look at the dynamics of risk aversion, if you put people in a lab and you give them all these studies, what you'll actually find is that there isn't the way that people would respond to risk if that curve explained their behavior in the Alli paradox doesn't really work. And so one way of trying to generalize expected utility theory is to try and see whether there are ways of making risk aversion rational in a way that more closely matches human behavior. A thing that I do, again, to sort of switch the subject, that's kind of almost entirely different, is I look at the meanings of words, right? Especially words that people use in logic when they reason about cases and stuff like that. And there are certain characteristic sorts of things that we tend to call fallacies that people make when they reason. There's a lot of probabilistic fallacies, the base rate fallacy, the conjunction fallacy, stuff like that. And one question is, how fallacious are these things really? If you were going to try and be the devil's advocate, is there a way that we could see that behavior as not irrational, but merely predicted to be rational by a more complex theory of how utility works? If you did that, well, there's kind of a lot of results in how markets work and stuff like that that are all built on this basic idea of expected utility maximization that will all go haywire, and actually it can get pretty complicated. So trying to find the line between the normative and the descriptive in places where it's fuzzy is kind of a place where research happens.
Thank you. Because being a psychology major, I've only taken one philosophy course. So
which one was it?
I just took an intro class, so didn't get into deep theory or anything like that. But I think it speaks to how much the two fields are tied together. And another question. So can both of you kind of define what normative versus descriptive is, and kind of normative decision theory versus descriptive decision theory, and possibly how they impact human behavior?
Sure.
Yeah, so I can jump in there. Normative it's closer to the sort of how an economist would say is the correct way to make a decision, right? It's the sort of ideal decision that if you had all the time and all the resources and all the information, it is like the best decision you could make, right? Like what is going to maximize your chances of winning this gamble if you were to play it over and over again, right? And so it's the kind of technically right? Like a computer would typically be using the normative approaches. And so obviously having all the information, having unlimited time, having unlimited processing power is not super realistic in almost any situation, unless you kind of already have programmed a computer to do it for you, which is sort of kind of cheating. So in the real world, the ways that people make actual decisions are the descriptive theories cover those, right? Just describing how people think and decide. And sort of how I think how you see these different theories, it depends a lot on what perspective you're coming from, right? So if you're coming from an econ, like a normative perspective, where your definition of rational is like following the normative model, right? That's rational. Anything else is irrational. Then your questions are sort of like, well, why are people deviating so much from the rational, right? Like, not quite what is wrong with people, but kind of, well, why are people not perfect computers? But if you're coming at it from a, just like, people are doing something really interesting. People are doing something different. So what are they doing and why? And like, how did this come about? And what are the parameters that are governing how people make decisions? That's more the descriptive model. It's more the approach that a psychologist would take as opposed to an economist. And I guess, Professor Fusco, is that more of the philosophy side, or it sounds like you guys actually use the normative models more than I would have thought.
Yeah, it's difficult to say. I mean, like I said, it's kind of like we go where the distinction gets messy. So, it's funny. So when I was in grad school, I had a roommate who was a neuroeconomics guy who basically studied like marketing. So for example, when you study how people make decisions or decision making, there's kind of two questions you can ask, right? You can ask, what decisions ought I to make, and what kinds of mistakes do people characteristically make such that they fall short of some ideal of rationality? So you can make a simple theory of how you ought to act. You ought to always maximize utility or something. And then you can study like ways that people fall short of that. And that's what people study in marketing when they're trying to like get people to buy stuff, and they're trying to become better advertisers, and they're trying to get people to like donate more money to charity or something. I mean, that's what my grad school roommate was studying. He wasn't doing it for nefarious purposes, but the psychology of manipulation for framing effects and stuff is essentially the same, whether you're using it for good or for ill, right? So he was trying to sort of get a PhD in how to trick people into like being more environmentally friendly in their consumer habits. And I used to come home and he would be like, I've got this like riddle for you. Would you rather have gamble A or gamble B? Would you rather have gamble C or gamble D? And every time I would sort of like, write out the thing, and I would be like, well, they're the same, or whatever. I would give the answer that the calculations gave me, and it'd be like, because I like didn't fall for whatever like framing effect he was testing. And, I didn't fall for it just because I was like plugging the numbers, and that's kind of like, it's sort of like cheating in a way. Like once you know the theory, then yeah, I can just, and some people are just more interested in the question, well, why do we make these mistakes? That might actually be sort of more complex, more interesting, tell us more about evolutionary history, tell us more about, I don't know, how altruistic behavior arises and other things that are sort of mysterious from an individual utility maximization point of view, how cultures evolve, how values evolve in cultures at different times in history when technology changes. That stuff might be sort of more interesting than trying to pursue the normative theory. On the other hand, there are philosophers, like in particular, I had in mind when I was talking about risk aversion, someone who I worked with a bit in grad school, who was a philosopher and a decision theorist. And she had a more complicated normative theory of risk aversion. She said, look, there's a reason why we avoid risk with these characteristic patterns that don't match a flattening utility curve. So the classic economic theory of risk aversion is inadequate. And what she did was really, this is Laura Buchak, she's at Princeton. What she did basically was argue that the way that we thought about risk aversion wasn't irrational, but it sort of reflected more altruistic ways of thinking about decision situations. And if you modeled people as doing that, who's to say that that's irrational? I mean, in groups, it could actually be more beneficial than maximizing individual utility. So what she was doing was sort of working out a mathematical theory, but it was a mathematical theory that was supposed to match behavior better than the classic economic theory. So her theories all worked out. She has certain formal results about it. She wrote a book about it. And, my understanding for how different fields interact is like her view is a minority view, widely ignored by working economists, but I don't think that means she's wrong. There just isn't enough contact sometimes between the fields.
I think I'm going to say something that I think is almost the same thing that you're saying, but just sort of like couched in the psych terms, because I think this is the answer to a question that Allison was planning on asking later on, but it's okay if we jump to it, Allison. Okay. Because it's the question of like, why do people make irrational decisions, right? And in asking that question, you have to sort of first define, what do I mean by irrational, right? And often the base definition is normative, right? Normative says what's rational, and non-normative is irrational, right? So if you're not following normative economic theory, you're doing something irrational, right? But people are descriptively, right? What we actually see people doing is behaving, technically normatively irrationally, but in like very consistent, very systematic ways, right? It's what like Dan Ariely calls it predictably irrational. Gerhard Gigerenzer calls it boundedly rational, right? Rational, but like within these bounds of like what is possible in real humans in the real world, not perfect computers with unlimited resources. Because so human brain is amazing and we can do just kind of unbelievable things with it, but it's limited, right? Our processing power and our just ability to take in, all of these stimuli and all of this information, and we're continually getting information, being asked to make judgments and decisions, all of the time. So if we were making all these decisions normatively, we would like spend all day just catching up with like the first hour of the things that are put on our plate, right? So the solution there, that the way that we look at it in psychology, is that we seem to have evolved or developed these heuristics that are just these like rules of thumb. They're these cognitive rules that kind of help make complex decisions easier. And they do that by saying like, all right, instead of answering the exact question you asked me, I'm going to sort of answer a proxy question instead, right? So like if you ask me, are there more dry cleaners or coffee shops in Manhattan, right? The normative way to answer that is like, let me get a phone book and let me like count both of them and compare the numbers, or search Google Maps or something, right? That would take a lot of time. It would take a lot of effort. If I want to make a decision or a judgment in like 10 seconds, I can instead just think like, all right, well, how many coffee shops can I think of, like easily bring to mind? How many dry cleaners can I easily bring to mind? Let me just sort of model this in my imagination and then see which of those numbers is bigger, right? And that's using a heuristic that's called the availability heuristic, right? What's kind of psychologically available, what's easily brought to mind. And I use availability then as a proxy for frequency. And a lot of times this works pretty well, right? Because things that are more frequent in my environment are going to be more available. They'll just come to mind easier because they're around me. I see them all the time. But it's not always exactly a perfect correlation, right? There are plenty of things that are really available because, not just because they're frequent, but because they're very vivid, or they're very salient to me, or they just happened recently, right? So like if I am a coffee drinker and I, in the last year, I don't think I've been to the dry cleaners once, right? So if you ask me this question now, I'll be like, as far as I know, there are no dry cleaners in Manhattan, right? I mean, I know there are some, but I can't think of any examples. So, so availability is pretty good most of the time. All of these cognitive heuristics are pretty good most of the time, right? They get us to the right answer. They get us close enough that we can kind of go about our day and move on. But then there are cases like, for example, if you ask most people, are you more scared of plane travel or traveling by car? Most of us know that technically, normatively speaking, car travel is more dangerous, right? More people are injured or die from car accidents each year than plane accidents. But most people are just inherently more afraid, right? You're sitting on a plane and there's turbulence and you're more afraid than like when you're in a car and it's skidding or something. And there are lots of reasons to that, but one of them is that plane crashes are just more available, right? When they happen, they're more vivid, they get covered in the news for long periods of time. They often have kind of like names that we can kind of search our memory and be like, oh, that's, Malaysian flight, whatever. And so car crashes, they don't get covered in the news. They're much more common, but they're harder for us to think of examples of. So they're less available. Excuse me. I knew my voice was going to give out. All right.
Can I say one more thing about that, just as far as normative and descriptive? I mean, this is sort of interesting from my point of view. The normative descriptive contrast is often invoked in linguistics, right? So there was a time pre-Chomsky when people took linguistics to be the study of how to speak correctly. After Chomsky, it became much more empirical, much more descriptive. The question was, how do people really speak? So there were certain rules that had always been encoded. English is an easy example. There have been rules that were always encoded in English grammar books that really weren't reflected in how people spoke. And so observing those patterns was more a sign of sort of having a fancy education than being a native speaker of the language. It's fair to say, I think, at a bird's eye view, that what Chomsky discovered is, in trying to make a science of linguistics, the most robust and interesting patterns that people exhibit are the patterns that native speakers exhibit, not the patterns that people exhibit when they've been drilled in school not to do something that comes naturally to them. So, classic case in English is preposition stranding. Ending a sentence with a preposition is supposed to be a no-no, but English speakers do it all the time. I think it was Mark Twain who said, like, this is a rule up with which I cannot put. The point being that the natural way of saying that is, this is a rule I can't put up with, but that would end the sentence with a preposition. Right. So, at some point under pressure from Chomsky, basically linguistics started to be more like a science by pursuing the patterns that were more descriptive rather than normative. And now normative linguistics has a really bad rap in linguistics. It basically means you're a school marmish person who sort of wants to who rap people on the knuckles for ending sentences with prepositions. If you take a look at that language, what English would be like if it didn't have that feature, it would be less scientifically beautiful, simple, interesting in the way that patterns in physics or chemistry are than if you would just let people do what comes natural. So that's a reason for being sort of descriptive in the relevant sense rather than normative.
Thank you both. That was really interesting to learn about, because, growing up, I have to constantly be taking in information and learning how I'm making decisions and why, and that's what interests me. That's why I majored in psychology as well. So it's really interesting to hear both perspectives. And then I think we only have time for about 3 more questions. So this is for both of you. So do you think the belief in superstitions is a conscious decision people make? So I know there's kind of like, there might not be tons of research on it necessarily, but I think I definitely find myself relying on superstitions in times of stress and uncertainty and don't know if I'm actually really thinking that I'm doing it, or like knowing that that's what I'm doing necessarily. But if you can speak to that in the best way that you possibly can.
Yeah, I'll jump in first because I have a pretty short answer, I think. Is use of superstitions a conscious decision? It definitely can be, right? And some people will do it more and some people will avoid doing it specifically, like intentionally, but it doesn't need to be conscious, right? And it's the same answer I would give for use of cognitive heuristics, actually. The use of heuristics, they're rules, right? So if you want to say, like, judge the frequency by how many examples you can think of, right? Like, you could do that explicitly and consciously and kind of purposefully, but your brain will also just do it on its own, right? So heuristics can be deliberately applied as decision rules, but they also just kind of run automatically in the background, right? Often without us being particularly aware of it. And that's sort of, when we think about sort of the divide between normative and descriptive, that's often the place where we note that, when people are getting into trouble, right? When people are exhibiting what we call fallacies, we call biases, usually that just means like, oh, there's a difference between the descriptive and the normative, right? So when we're using these rules, these heuristics, without a lot of awareness, that's when we're more likely to kind of go off the rails, the normative rails a little bit. So for a lot of people, unless they take or teach a decision-making course, or I suppose come to an event like this, then we may not be thinking about these things at all, right? We may not be thinking about, actively like, oh, this is a superstition, or, oh, I'm ascribing this to luck, but it's really random chance. But when we do take those classes or teach those classes, then we can tend to become hyper aware of it. And that can be useful sometimes, like the introspection. It can be maybe sort of disruptive at times because we then get in our heads and we're like, oh no, I'm being so irrational, but is that bad? And then you get into the meta loop. So I said that was going to be a short answer. It wasn't really in the end, but that's my answer to that question.
And then Professor Fusco.
So it's about whether like people can like knowingly believe superstitions, like things that they believe are unsupported by evidence.
Yeah, like whether it's a conscious choice to kind of follow through on a superstition, like, you know, knocking on wood, like I'm going to do this right now. Like kind of if belief in superstitions is, you know, a conscious decision that people make in the simplest of terms.
Yeah, I mean, maybe just to give a contrasting answer, I think there's an important sense in which it's not clearly obvious that you can believe something you also believe to be unsupported by evidence. You know, I'll again give you an example about how philosophy is kind of, a lot of literature in philosophy is driven by these puzzles and paradoxes and stuff like that. There's a famous article about the psychological structure of intention, called the toxin puzzle. And this goes back, I should say, to a time, some of these questions go back to sort of Plato and Aristotle. I mean, philosophy is really old in that sense, right? So they go back to, you know, one thing to keep in mind about Aristotle or Plato's time is that psychology hadn't sort of been separated from philosophy. And so when you asked about sort of like, what's the structure of a rational intention, maybe you weren't clearly distinguishing what you meant by, you know, as a descriptive question or as a normative question, what would it take for a mental state to count as an intention or something like that. So Aristotle asked these questions that seem really puzzling to us now, like how is weakness of the will possible? Right. Now, a lot of people are sort of like, what do you mean, how is weakness of the will possible? Like, I'm weak-willed 8 times before breakfast every day. Like, what do you mean, how is it possible? It's like, that's like asking how breathing is possible or anything else that I do all the time. One of the things that I have to do in class, you know, in like the core, is try and convince people that there's a sense in which that question is really interesting. How is weakness of the will possible is an interesting question in the sense that it asks, what kind of state are you in when you want to do something you know is the lesser good, right? That's how Aristotle puts it. What counts to be acratic, akrasia is the Greek name for weakness of the will, is that you're going to do something that by your own lights, you know, according to your own beliefs, is the less desirable of, you know, 2 or more choices that you have. Likewise, there's kind of a puzzle about how, if superstition is just something you take to be unsupported by the evidence, how you could choose to believe something that you believe is less likely to be true than something else. Aristotle thought that that was super puzzling because, you know, again, a way of putting it is, well, if you opt for the thing that is the lesser, you're acratic, so you smoke the cigarette when you're trying to quit or whatever, you know, it is. What I guess Greeks didn't have cigarettes. You know, what is your motivation? Because ordinarily we want to say your motivation is that you think it's better than the alternative. That's just what explains why people do things. For example, that's the dividing line between intentional action and accidental action. You know, if somebody asks you, like, why did you trip on the sidewalk? You can just say, well, I didn't have a reason. I didn't see it as better than any alternatives. It's just an accident. That distinguishes the line between intentional and unintentional action. So are acratic actions unintentional? Well, they don't seem unintentional the way that tripping is. And so we need a theory of sort of the explanation of human behavior that has this weird middle ground. And so one way that sort of Aristotle's work has evolved is into what we now call sort of moral psychology. And another way that it's evolved is into descriptive psychology, where sort of people try and pursue those questions in a different way. But anyway, my official answer is no.
I like that. Just to jump really quickly on that, I love that question because I hadn't thought about it from a philosophical standpoint, but it's something that descriptively in cognitive psychology, we have kind of an answer, and it may end up being kind of a glib answer, and because it's not really a question you're supposed to be able to answer right fully. But so my answer would be that we have different modes of decision making, and we can do very calculated, you know, cost benefit based decisions, or like think about our goals and like which of these actions will meet more of my goals or meet my goals better in some way or be better off for me, you know, which one is making me healthier or save more money for retirement or whatever. But we also make decisions in these sort of rule-based ways where we just have principles that we follow, or we're just like, well, my role in this situation is as a teacher, and so this is the appropriate behavior and I'll follow it. But we also just make decisions based on affect, right? Like we want to seek out things that make us happy or other positive emotions, and we avoid things that make us feel negative emotions. And so you can say like, yes, not eating this ice cream is definitely the right decision, but I want to. And when those modes conflict, sometimes the affect wins out. Maybe often the affect wins out. And so I like the idea of arguing about whether that makes us weak-willed or just, choosing to use a different mode, right? That's sort of a cop-out way to describe it, perhaps. But I will actually, back to the original question, I will say that a lot of times in these studies, and I guess we haven't had a lot of actual empirical data invoked yet in this discussion, but so from studies of, often there's lots of studies of athletes and superstitions. And in almost every case, they say like, no, I don't actually think this like pre-game ritual, whatever it is, I don't actually think it's going to affect the outcome of the game. But they still want to do it, right? They still like to do it, and they still would feel uncomfortable if they didn't, right? So it's almost, the question maybe is almost both, right? Like I know it doesn't work, but I still kind of believe in it, right? Which is another one of these dualities, I guess, that humans are so good at.
So thank you for those very insightful responses. I know I took some notes during both of this, so I could look up kind of the theories and the explanations that you gave as well. So it looks like we have time for our 2 Q&A questions, which are really good questions. So the first one has to tie back in to one of the first questions we asked, which is, if causality is a pointless superstition, how does anything happen in this world? For example, would that mean that the COVID-19 virus does not cause COVID within that philosophical framework?
Sure, yeah. Thanks. I mean, that's definitely, so, if nothing causes anything, then nothing causes COVID-19. I mean, that really does follow, right? But I mean, this is David Hume, so, indeed, nothing causes anything. I see that, but maybe to speak a little bit more to the question, we can know, I think, that something that we do is correlated with a good outcome without causing it. And we make those judgments when we act. And I think that there's sort of, broadly speaking, in the literature, there's sort of 2 ways of thinking about that. One is that we're born with a certain beliefs about causal structure. And there are some things that can cause us to change our minds about causal structure, but it's subtle and we don't have a good theory of why that happens. So for people who are sort of like Bayesians here, right? We have an idea of how, if you're a Bayesian, you start out with some prior, and then you update, you conditionalize on all of your evidence. And we understand exactly how you do that. Now, that will affect what your posterior probabilities are. We don't have a theory that works quite like that about how you begin, not with a prior probability distribution, but something richer, an initial sketch of causal relationships in the world and how you would update that. But it seems like that doing that is a fundamental part of rationality, unless you want to be the kind of skeptic that David Hume was and just go, well, all that stuff is pointless superstition. Just do, when it comes to decision making, for example, just do things that sort of are correlated with the good outcomes and hope for the best. Don't try and guess what your causes are. So let me say something really quick about the difference that this sometimes can make, right? This is an example that I sometimes use with students. So you have amnesia and you wake up in a hospital bed. you don't know who you are, you don't know your name, you don't know anything about your past, and you don't know whether you're rich or poor, but you would prefer to be rich rather than poor, like probably most people. Now someone comes in and says, okay, we mixed you up with another patient, you know, we're not sure who you are. So there's these two watches that we took off of patients before surgery, two wristwatches. One is, I don't really know how this works. One's like a Rolex, an expensive watch, and one's like a Timex, a really cheap watch, like a plastic one. Which one do you want? Like, which one do you prefer? So there's two ways of thinking about this, and I should have described it in a little more detail, but here's two ways of thinking about it. If you own the Rolex rather than Timex, that's evidence that you're rich, right? Because rich people tend to have more expensive stuff. Suppose, however, that the person said, not which one would you rather learn is yours, but which one would you rather make it the case is yours, right? So now this is not a guess about what is already the case. This is a question about a decision. What do you want to do, assuming that you can intervene on the world causally? Now, what would you choose? Well, it seems like your decision would be reversed, right? Because if you care more about money than about watches, and you only see watches as like a sign of whether you're rich, then you would want the cheaper watch because it's going to cost you money. If they're asking you which one do you want to buy the Timex, but if you had already bought it, you want to learn that you have the Rolex, right? So there are correlations in data that you would ignore in decision-making situations. The evidence that learning that you have a Rolex would give you for being rich is going to be canceled out in decision-making by the fact that it makes you poorer than the alternative. So when you make decisions like that, it seems like what you're bringing to bear is not just your statistical knowledge, you're bringing to bear beliefs that you have for good reasons about the causal structure of the world. But where do those come from and how do we update them rationally? That's a really, really open question in the science of causal modeling, in philosophy, insofar as it's continuous. There are people who work in both fields.
Thank you. That was a really good, analogy to think of, especially because I don't know how often it happens.
About the watch brands, right? I used to know.
And then our second question in the Q&A is, would people who believe in superstitions tend to stay motivated on their own life? If so, can we be taught to believe in superstitious beliefs? What are some examples?
Ooh. Do you want to take that one?
Yeah, so sorry, can you read the first part of it again?
Would people who believe in superstitions tend to stay motivated throughout, like more motivated throughout their whole life? If so, can we be taught to believe in superstitious beliefs? And what are some examples?
That's a really interesting question. I think, so superstitions aren't the only thing that motivates us. So maybe the people who don't tend to buy as much into superstitions are using something else to motivate them, right? Maybe they're the ones who tend to be more overconfident. Although you could probably make a case for overconfidence as a sort of superstition, sort of in yourself and your own abilities, perhaps. But yeah, I think so. There's a lot in psychology. There's a whole area of it includes some heuristics and biases, and it includes just some sort of cognitive tendencies. It's called motivated reasoning, right? It's just like we think in some ways in ways that we want to think, right? So like confirmation bias is a big one. Like it's kind of surprising that hasn't come up yet, because right, if it's basically just the idea that if we already have a belief coming into a situation, we're more amenable to, we're more willing to believe and listen to and spend time with information that's consistent with that belief. And we're more likely to try to insulate ourselves from information that challenges that belief, right? Either by avoiding it, like avoiding situations where we know it's going to come up, right? Like, you avoid a certain news channel because you're like, that's just going to infuriate me. But also when you hear that information, to either just flat out deny it or to find some ways of discounting it, right? To argue against it. And people are very, very good at this, right? And we have lots and lots of examples in the real world, very much now, but all throughout, human history. People are good at kind of seeing the world the way they want to. So I guess the answer to your question is it depends on if you think, my answer depends on if you think these sort of motivated reasoning approaches are superstition or are something separate, because people are always going to reason in these motivated ways, right? Confirmation bias and then things like cognitive dissonance are all kind of protecting us from things that are going to make us uncomfortable to some extent, and from things we don't want to hear or believe or do. So maybe some people use superstition more and some people use some of these other strategies more. I don't have an answer that's really well grounded in the data, but sorry, and let me, I just realized I can actually look at the questions myself. Can we be taught to believe in superstitious beliefs? What are some examples? It's a really good, I think that's almost a philosophical question. So maybe Professor Fusco has a better answer than I do for that. We can, to some extent, we could be kind of taught or trained away from superstitious beliefs. If they're really compelling, we may still kind of, we'd be like the baseball players who are like, I know these socks don't actually make me win, but I still want to use them. Right, so you can be taught sort of the science and say like, okay, look, this is the experimental method, and here's how we, here's the best way we can, here's how we can get closest to understanding causality, right? Like we, in a very controlled way, we manipulate variable X, and then if Y changes, and if we did a good job, and if X variable is the only difference between the two conditions, then we can infer that X probably influences Y in some causal way, right? But the strength of our answer depends on how well we design that study, right? So now I've sort of verged off of the original topic, I realize, but yeah, I mean, we can be taught to be more rational. It's usually the direction we're going. So I really like the question of like, can we be taught to be more superstitious? I guess maybe like we can give ourselves permission to be more superstitious perhaps, or say like, look, in cases where this is not gonna hurt anybody and it's not gonna hurt me, like, let me let myself kind of believe in magical thinking, right? And there are whole areas of fiction that are like just like beautiful books that are this kind of like magical realism where you're like, well, obviously the world doesn't really work like that, but like, it's delightful to read, right? So yeah, maybe we can allow ourselves to let more of that into our lives. It might be nice, right?
Yeah, I think it would be. So those are all of the questions we have. So thank you so much for answering our questions and answering the Q&A questions as well. We really appreciated all of your responses and your participation in this event. It's our second to last event of the semester. So we really appreciate you taking the time out of your day to answer these questions about, decision making and why human beings are so, susceptible to kind of not making the most normative decisions, but how, descriptive decision making often, does lead to a good outcome sometimes. So thank you very, very much. And thank you to all who attended this event. We really appreciate your participation and asking questions. And we have another event for this semester, so be on the lookout for our last event of the semester before everyone is graduating. So thank you so much for joining. We really appreciate it. And thank
Much
you
for having us. Thanks, everybody. Thanks for your questions, for listening.
Bye-bye. Stay safe.